So let's talk about backward compatibility on new Nintendo hardware. We're all assuming that the new Nintendo hardware will be fully backward compatible with the Nintendo Switch, but I'm here to tell you that I wouldn't be so sure. So there's been some recent talk about the Nintendo Switch 2 thanks to a leaked 4chan post of an alleged developer that suggested that he had access to next generation Switch hardware and was working on patches for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet that was targeting a new piece of Nintendo hardware, specifically a next generation Switch model. Many people believe that the new Nintendo hardware will incorporate fully backward compatibility with the current Switch, but in my opinion, I think that Nintendo has a backward compatibility concern that gives me pause if they will actually commit to bringing the entire Switch library to next gen. We're going to get a little technical here, so I will keep it as high level as possible. I want to be clear that this discussion is about Switch games that you either have bought physically or own via eShop on your Nintendo account. Nintendo Switch Online, or NSO, is something that I expect to be brought forward because it's fully digital and easily ported to new hardware. I also expect Nintendo to continue building on the NSO with the introduction of new hardware. Second, I wanted to cover what Nintendo told investors in November of 2022, specifically Shigeru Miyamoto. He said that backward compatibility is easier than ever because all of the processes have been standardized. They currently have the tools that allows players to enjoy older video games on newer consoles more easily than ever before. However, I want to be clear that this was not a confirmation of backward compatibility, and Miyamoto reaffirmed to investors that Nintendo's strength is creating new video game experiences. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's get a little bit technical. Let's assume that the new Nintendo Switch model has a new SoC, which is a generational leap over the current Tegra X1 that the system currently houses, and it has more power, more RAM, and possibly 4K visuals via modern reconstruction techniques, either via DLSS, FSR, or whatever. That totally makes sense, right? The Switch has done so well for Nintendo, and its current president plays things pretty safe, so it's unlikely that Nintendo would completely pivot away from the Switch model. It's also irrelevant to this discussion about how much more powerful the new Nintendo hardware might be. For this discussion, the focus is purely on the SoC. Of course, we know that Nvidia developed the Tegra X1, which is using the old Maxwell architecture, and we expect that Nvidia will host the SoC of the new Nintendo Switch model, perhaps using Lovelace or Ampere. The actual SoC has been rumored, but that's not really that important. All we know is that it's a different architecture or binary incompatible with a Tegra X1, even though both are ARM64 based. This means Nintendo can focus their new SDK, for all intents and purposes, as an iteration of the current Switch SDK with specific changes for the new hardware. This makes sense because developers can easily migrate over to the newer hardware and have a very familiar SDK to work with. The GPU stack is rumored to run NVN2, an iteration of NVN that runs on the Switch, although that particular leak as of the making of this video has no direct linkage to a new Nintendo Switch model. It's suggested that NVN2 will power the new Switch, and it makes sense, but at this time, it's only speculation. So Nvidia powers the current Switch, and Nvidia will power the next generation model. So backward compatibility should be easy, right? It's Nvidia, it's ARM based, it's a newer SoC, a call to draw a triangle on the screen on the Switch should be one-to-one backward compatible with drawing a triangle on screen on a newer piece of hardware, right? Well, the answer is no. In fact, this is where I've hit a bit of a junction trying to understand Nintendo's strategy. Let's talk about how software runs on the Switch. When you install a Switch game, it sits on top of the operating system known as Horizon OS. This physical game data itself comes built in with what's known as Nintendo Shared Object or NSO files, and this is not the same as the Nintendo Switch Online NSO that you may have heard of. These system objects that are brought in embeds a full Tegra X1 Maxwell GPU driver stack inside of every single Nintendo Switch game regardless of first or third party. Any shaders that are pre-compiled are also bundled with the game, and this is the root cause of the backward compatibility problem. A new SoC to power a new Switch hardware will simply not be binary compatible with this code, even though it's still on ARM64 architecture. Now you might be wondering, on my PC, I can simply update my GPU drivers when I get a new graphics card. So why is it possible to do it on my PC, but not possible to do it on a next generation piece of Nintendo hardware? Because the GPU driver stack is not statically bundled into the game. Drivers are installed externally to the game as a dependency. And when Nvidia updates its GPU drivers, you know it simply works because its legacy around that is known as the Unified Driver Architecture, or UDA. This simply means that your existing games that target Nvidia GPU driver stack will work on any updated drivers, and we know this to be true on the PC. On the Switch, however, UDA is mostly irrelevant because of its custom operating system, Horizon OS, and again, due to the embedded nature of the GPU driver stack. So the TLDR here is that if Nintendo is to move away from the Tegra X1, which we all feel strongly that they will probably do, then current Switch games won't work on new hardware. That is, without recompiling the games to target that hardware. So how does Nintendo solve for this issue? Of course there are solutions to all this. This is not a inconceivable or a insurmountable issue, and there are some solutions here. The first one is good old software emulation. Just like what we've seen with the Xbox Series consoles being backward compatible with older OG and 360 games, Nintendo could build an emulation layer to manage this in software. This one does seem a little far-fetched, as it does require significant processing power to emulate Switch games at the OS level. This would require fairly powerful hardware. However, we have seen the Steam Deck that can run Switch games in software at a pretty good level of performance, but it's unlikely that Nintendo would look at providing this much power to a next-generation handheld when the concerns are to maintain a good battery life. The second option would be to supply Tegra X1 compatibility within the new SoC itself, but existing successor architectures do not have this backward compatibility support as of the making of this episode. It's possible that Nvidia and Nintendo have already solved for this, but again, we have not seen any evidence of this, and it's hard to imagine that this information has not yet leaked. Compare that to the PS5, where almost 10 months before the launch, we had learnt about the PS5's new SoC that had specific modes to switch back clock speeds in line with the PS4 and the PS4 Pro. The third option is something that's more in line with Nintendo's legacy of providing backward compatibility, and that is to simply bundle in a Tegra X1 chip on each motherboard of new Nintendo hardware and provide a fallback sandbox for you to play your older games, just like the GameCube on the Wii and the Game Boy on the GBA, for example. They've done this before, and it's possible they could do it again and include an option. However, this would incur a cost increase and may not fit within Nintendo's plans to move forward. They'd also need to keep the exact same cartridge format as used on the Nintendo Switch, or supply a legacy cartridge slot for physical games. Both of these have their own issues. If Nintendo is to retain the same cartridge format on a new generation, then it will simply bring over all the concerns and issues of the current cartridge format to a new generation, and that has to do with the price of producing physical media, especially when we start talking about games that require a 32GB cartridge size or greater. I personally speculate that Nintendo will do away with the existing cartridge format and introduce a brand new one, which will not only be cheaper, it will be faster and more secure. And then we move over to option 4, and I personally think this is the one that makes the most sense, and that is each game that is brought forward will need patches to run on new hardware. And if we are to take this 4chan Pokemon leak seriously, then this appears as though this is what's actually happening. The problem, however, with this approach is that every single Switch game would need to be patched for it to run on new hardware. And this includes both digital and physical games. It doesn't seem feasible with well over 4,000 Switch titles out there. The amount of work needed in this sense is just astronomical. What's more likely here is that Nintendo will carefully curate and offer next-gen patches for most of their first-party lineup and extend that out to third parties. But the idea that every Switch game needs resubmission for a next-gen patch sounds a little far-fetched. And then we move to the most controversial one that I saved till last, and that is to simply do nothing. Keep Switch games on the Switch and bring some games forward via updates. It sounds absurd to say this, right? But it is possible. Backward compatibility is something that everyone wants, but this is not like the PlayStation 5 where it's a large chunk of hardware that's replacing a PlayStation 4. We're talking about a handheld device that I can easily play and take with me. I can take two systems with me without issue. Nintendo may simply leave Switch games on the Switch and offer up any next-gen updates as they see fit. Sounds far-fetched? Well, maybe, but there is some market research that suggests that backward compatibility, while sounding like a pivotal feature, may not be as important in practice. While many people invest in new hardware, they want to have new experiences with that hardware and not worry about the past. And I guess the absolute last option is maybe we've all kind of been taken for a bit of a ride, or we've just made some false assumptions along the way. What if Nintendo is not considering replacing the Tegra X1 with a new SoC? There is obviously room to overclock the Switch. We've seen myself on numerous videos in the past overclocking games on the Switch. There is definitely some headroom to boost both CPU and GPU clocks and memory clocks and basically get a organic level of a performance boost just from those things. So what if Nintendo is only looking to improve the current Tegra X1 model? That would definitely solve for the backward compatibility problem, because your existing games and your new games are still running on the Tegra X1 Maxwell architecture. I personally don't think this is going to happen. I do think Nintendo is going to pretty much step away from the X1. And if we are talking about supporting the X1 in this fashion, I guess what we're saying is then that we're talking about a Nintendo Switch Pro and not a next generation model. But there are my thoughts and speculations about backward compatibility. I don't think this is a done deal in any stretch of the imagination. I think Nintendo has gone through each of these possible scenarios and are trying to figure out, or maybe have already figured out, what the next plan of attack is. But I personally do think that we will see some games come forward, but I don't believe we'll see the entire suite of all 4,000 plus Switch games come to the next generation hardware and be playable. I think unless they actually embed a Tegra X1 inside of the next motherboard, this is probably not going to happen. But that's going to do it for today's episode, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.